Welcome, one and all, to another episode of Writing for Roleplay. In this corner, we have our incredibly handsome host, Kevin Carpenter. And in the other corner, you know her, you love her, it's...
Kayla.
Let's get ready to roleplay!
Oh my god, I forgot you were a wrestler.
Oh, yes.
Did you ever think about, I mean, I know, okay, so I know, like, you did, like, you did, like, sport wrestling.
Yes, the real wrestling.
Yeah. Did you ever think about becoming a, like, show wrestler?
Oh, God, no.
Really?
Yeah. Well, for one thing, I wasn't that good at the real wrestling.
It's all, you know, like, you don't have to be that good at it. You just need to be able to, like...
You have to be able to do some incredible athletic stuff in order to be like a WWE or just a performative wrestler in general. You still have to do the flips.
Oh, so you couldn't even do a flip.
I mean, not now.
I thought you meant, like... Okay, no, I wasn't saying, like, you don't have to be that good, like, you don't have to be, like, an athlete or whatever to be a wrestler. Like, obviously you do. That's what I know. I was just saying, like, when you said I wasn't very good, I thought you just meant, like, you lost a lot.
Oh. Not, like,
that you weren't, like, athletic or strong or whatever.
Well, I'll just say this. I didn't win a lot.
Okay. No, I understand. They're doing, like, real stunts and shit. Like, I understand. Like, these guys are, like, top athletes. I know that. I thought you were just saying, like, oh, you weren't. Because, I mean, also it's, like, kind of a different sort of type of, it's a different type of, like, physical
Welcome for joining us today, audience. Anyway. The reason for this special intro for this episode is...
We're talking about pretend wrestling.
Pretend wrestling. We are
imaginary
talking about wrestling. We are talking about how to do great fight scenes within your role-playing games for this episode. As we mentioned in our previous episode, combat and narrative are not separate. They do not need to be separate. You can have combat scenes and still roleplay within the fights. As you said, you know, it's a popular saying that in musicals, the moment where everyone bursts into song is the moment where all of the emotions are riding high and they just need to explode out. And in musicals, that's the musical number. And in action movies, that's the fight scene. And in your role-playing game, that is the combat scene. And oh boy, are they so fun to play, and oh boy, can they add a lot to the narrative. So today we're going to be talking about combat in your role-playing games and how they are not separate from the narrative that you are trying to get at your table.
Yes, obviously there are lots of RPGs that don't center on combat.
Of course.
And we're not talking about them today. We're talking about the war games. We're talking about combat. We might talk about conflict a little bit as well within this. And the way that we talk about conflict could be useful for RPG games that do not have, like, for lack of a better term, like physical combat, imaginary physical combat. But yeah, no, this is for the action adventure games for sure. And yeah, it is an action sequence in an action movie should progress character and plot. And I think that an action sequence in RPG is the same thing. It should progress character and plot.
So let's get right into it. So, once again, we are going to be kind of retreading old ground here because knowing how to do a fight scene in your role-playing game requires you to both know your genre and know the rules. Knowing the rules allows you to see what tools the game gives you to create these sort of fight scenes. You know, can you throw 20 skeletons at your party, or is it a horror game where one skeleton could kill them all easily and they have to run away? And then know your genre. Is this the kind of game where fighting a skeleton is appropriate, or is this more of a, like, hang on, why is there anything sort of magic here at all? This breaks my immersion. And then they start throwing tomatoes at you, GM.
Yeah.
This is why I don't allow tomatoes at my games. That's a dirty lie, by the way.
I was going to say, I've eaten tomatoes. Anyway,
So the first thing to think about
the energy for this episode is very hyper.
I don't know what it is. Is that Starbucks?
No, this is my breakfast smoothie that I made. My late breakfast smoothie. We've recorded an episode before this, guys, so we're a little, this is a great sidebar in at the table. Sometimes things get a little goofy and you have to rein in the players. And this happens a lot, I think, in combat, because it's turn-based combat does mean that the larger your group is, the longer people are waiting between turns. And this is where group size, I think, really can make or break a game. And smaller group sizes, I think, when you have combat heavy games, if you are somebody who enjoys playing a lot of combat in your game, I would strongly, strongly recommend that you have a smaller group so that combat does not take forever. I mean, the fact that Critical Role has 8 players, including the GM, and sometimes they bring in guests and they will have more. That is quite insane. And the reason that can work is because of how experienced of a GM Matt Mercer is, that he has been playing for like 20 some odd plus years. And at this point, how experienced his players are. And also, they're pretty, and again, some people are going to be like, oh, what are you talking about? Critical Role combat sucks. I don't like it. Lots of people do. It's subjective. But when you are playing at a game, one of the reasons I did not like D&D the first time that I played it was because I was a very new player playing with a bunch of other new players in a very large group. And combat took forever and I thought it was boring. So prefacing this from the top, smaller groups are very helpful for this. And if you have a lot of NPCs in the party, figuring out a way that not every NPC maybe needs to have like a full turn, like a player. Kevin often uses like a companion rule set with our NPCs in our game, where the NPCs sort of give another player, like another PC, some options to use in combat, or we'll kind of set it up like this NPC is going to help this character make advantage on their attack. Just because when you have a lot of players going and you have a lot of enemies going, it can really stretch, especially when you get high level fighters that are going like six actions or whatever, or 6 attacks in a turn, or you have wizards that are maybe doing some like complex spell mechanics. The big thing with combat is you got to keep this train moving and keeping people focused. I think it's a little okay for players to kind of have a little bit of quiet crosstalk in combat. Sometimes it can be, a player is double checking with another player, like, hey, I don't play this class a lot, but you do. Can you double check? Like, is this something that I could do? And, metagaming aside, like metagaming may be happening at the table. And that's kind of on your that's on your table and on your group on how much metagaming you want to allow. But a little bit of quiet crosstalk while people are waiting for their turn, I think can be okay, as long as everybody is like focused and hits the ground running when their turn comes up. And keeping people's attention, that can also be helpful. And if you are a player who, sometimes you have a hard time paying attention on every turn, which you should be keeping track when your turn comes up, because things that can happen, they will affect what you choose. Doodling, if drawing in like your notebook. I was always a kid in class. I always had to draw in all of my notes, like in math class, because I couldn't pay attention otherwise. Finding something that sort of helps you pay attention, I think is important. Maybe it's like even playing with like Play-Doh or something.
Well, it's interesting that a lot of the tips that you kind of rapid fired right there all kind of stem with keeping up the flow. And there's this interesting duality with especially combat focused RPGs, where when you get into combat, that's when a bunch of different rule systems start, activating and getting put in place. And narratively, combat scenes are quick. Like when you're writing prose, and you get to like a scene where someone's being chased or someone's getting into a fight, suddenly the sentences are shorter. Suddenly the words are more aggressive. Suddenly everything is going off at a quick pace in order to go with the quick emotion of the combat scene. But in role-playing games, when combat starts, like especially in D&D, it's like, okay, combat has now started. Okay, everyone roll initiative. All right, I need to pull up some stuff. Okay, I'm going to place the minis here. All right, I'm going to draw the map. All right, we've got all that prepared. All right, so now this person is going to go. Okay, this person does their full turn, and now everyone else at the table is waiting for that turn to go, and then the next person goes. And it's like suddenly, mechanically, there is a slowdown at the table at the moment when everything is high stakes and high energy, just like the beginning of this podcast.
Yeah, it's a very interesting contrast that can be I think a lot of people get turned off of combat because it can be kind of hard to keep that energy up and going.
And so keeping the flow going and keeping the flow going involves, knowing your rules of talking to your players and being like, all right, it's your turn. Please have an idea of what you want to do as we get to your turn. Like, pay attention. DMs will also be like, hey, this person's going, but this next person is on deck. And that's just with games with initiative systems. With games where anyone can take the spotlight, like a lot of Powered by the Apocalypse games, you're kind of wanting everyone at the table to be on, because at any moment, one of them can jump in and be like, okay, now my character wants to do this before, the monster tries to get away or something like that.
Yeah, I think sort of when you do have an initiative turn-based situation, doing the heads up of like, okay, player A is up, player B, you are on deck. And that saying that kind of triggers player B to like clue in and pay attention to what player A is doing so that they're ready to go, or like double check their spell sheet or whatever. There was an interesting, to bring up Critical Role again, recently at the time of recording, there had been stuff that happened in game, and guest player Amy Carrero ended up releasing after the session. She had made a flowchart for herself of, okay, when this happens or if this happens, my player is going to do this or that or whatever. That spelled out a lot of her. It was a very complicated like PvP situation. And it spelled out all of like her abilities, because she had like these big, heavy magic items that were giving her a lot of abilities and things like that. And so she made a flowchart that helped her manage this very complicated mechanical combat situation for this player. And I thought that was fascinating. So if you're playing a mechanically complex character of some kind, and you need to sort of come up with a cheat sheet for yourself of like when to use these spells or when to maybe use these maneuvers, just like on a separate like little piece of paper or whatever, to help you. I remember when I was playing a goblin, I kept forgetting that I had the Fury of the Small thing that allowed me to like throw on extra damage dice. And it was on my character sheet, but I kept forgetting about it because it was something like I could only use like limited. It wasn't something that I was used to turning on all of the time. So if you need to make for your player a combat cheat sheet of like, okay, when initiative starts, like, I'm going to make sure that I have, mage armor up, or I'm going to get spiritual weapon up right away, and kind of make a checklist for yourself. I think that's like a good idea.
Oh, yeah. And, on the GM side, just having your materials prepared, like, having your miniatures already like picked out, having the map already drawn on a board that you just kind of like leave in another room or something like that. And, like having like all the dice ahead of you, and just kind of having as much stuff preloaded, so that way when it gets into the combat and everyone's in that like, oh boy, high energy, we're about to get into some combat, let's go, you can keep that energy going. And that's kind of like the number one tip with combat, is just keep the energy going, make sure everyone's on their game, have your stuff prepped. If there's like stuff that you can shave off before the combat, set that up. But it's the same thing. It's just like in literature, as I said, or in a movie, like when a fight scene happens in the movie, suddenly the editing is very quick. When a fight scene happens in literature, suddenly the prose is very quick, very short, very snappy. And in RPGs, especially combat focused RPGs, you are fighting against a rule system where it's like, all right, combat has started, and now a bunch of rules are suddenly clicking into place that you have to like go through before you can get to the first punch.
Yeah. And I think so much of it, what can slow down combat too, is players becoming paralyzed. They become afraid to make a mistake. They want to choose the correct course of action here. And you guys, you gotta let that go. You have to be forgiving of other players at the table for making tactical mistakes. I think, if somebody is making a bad choice in combat, but they are not asking for help, let it go. Because you just need to keep going. And if bad choices are things that are coming up first, guess what? Roll with it. That's a story thing now.
Yeah.
If you don't know, if you're panicking because you're like, things have gotten so high stakes, people are going down, I don't know what to do. Fuck it. Metagame, call an audible, say, I don't know what to do. And then another player will be like, magic missile or dimension door over there. Like, you know what? If metagaming in combat helps keep it going, this is a hot take, I guess. If metagaming in combat keeps it going, I feel like that's okay. And it's different when it's a metagaming that is sort of like, there is a metagaming of like, you don't know that this enemy is over here taking down your bard because like you don't have line of sight, they're in a different room, etc. Like, your character doesn't know that. So your character, they can't just run off over there because they are facing another combatant in front of them. Like, that's going to be their priority realistically, you know, unless that character that's in trouble, like, calls for help or whatever, you know, it's like, that's different. Like, that is when you're getting into a point where it's like, these characters don't know this, but it's like, your character does know that they know magic missile. You, the player, are just stressed and you're forgetting. So if the other players at the table are helping you by saying, like, reminding, like, use spiritual weapon or whatever, I feel like that's okay, you know, because it gets like stressful. You do get forgetful, etc., etc. You know, you'd ask for help like in other situations. I don't understand why you can't ask for help in combat, remembering how like rules work or what maybe you could do and things like that. So I do think some measure of metagaming in combat to keep it going is okay.
Yeah. And another thing to keep in mind, too, when it comes to combat is thinking about how does your game system and your genre, once again, know your genre, how does your system and your genre treat combat? Because that's going to inform, like, the pace of the combat itself. Like, D&D, mostly combat focused. In fact, 4th edition made the focus of the game entirely combat, with both pros and cons, and we'll get back to the specifics on that later. But then you have Powered by the Apocalypse games that treat combat as a back and forth. Like, when you attack someone in a Powered by the Apocalypse games, for the most part, you are yourself opening yourself up to damage. And it's only on a high roll can you avoid that damage. So combat empowered by the apocalypse turns into a flow of how do I set this situation up so that way I have an unfair advantage, whether it's in Monster of the Week, figuring out the trap and the weakness of the monster, or in City of Mist or Apocalypse World, where it's like when we're going into this situation, we need to buff ourselves up so we are like hitting these guys like with surprise, like we're coming in punching them before they can even do anything.
Yeah. It's like a very grounded approach to combat. Yeah. It's a very like real world approach because most of us are not like super powerful demigods who can take fire breath and keep on punching. So yeah, a combat system that encourages your players to fight unfair fights and do dirty tricks or whatever on the enemies. Like, yeah, that's cool. That's very fun. That's very different from D&D.
Yeah. And, you know, you have like OSR games like Morkborg or like, you know, classic dungeon crawls where combat is simple, but it's also punishing. So it's almost best to be avoided or, you know, once again.
Also very grounded.
Exactly. Very grounded. Like, listen, you can go into a room and you and your 3 friends can probably kill these 2 guys in this room. But after that, you're going to be scraped up. And then you got 3 more rooms full of guys. Like, you got to figure that out. And then you have games that take interesting takes on combat. And one I need to bring up is a game called Thirsty Sword Lesbians.
Once again, a hilarious title.
Yes. This is another game that I have read but not played myself, mostly because it's hard for me, the straight cis man, to join a group that's playing Thirsty Sword Lesbians. And then it's like, okay, this makes sense. I just love the game's design and its art. And I think it does a lot of like cool things. Anyway, the combat system in Thirsty Sword Lesbians, and really the main conceit of the game, is that the fights, especially between players, are sexy dialogues. The combat system, you can either use your daring stat or your grace stat. So there's like 2 different ways that you can fight. But also in the fights, flirting with your opponent is an inbuilt option. And it gives you a game currency called strings that allows you to like weaponize emotional vulnerabilities and be like,
you're pulling the other player's strings.
Exactly.
That's fun.
Yeah.
That's PvP. RPGs that have like PvP combat is great because D&D is not set up for PvP combat.
No. And it's really interesting because all of these examples in these games use combat for like the feeling of the combat is different in all of these games. And you also have to think about what mood do you want from your combat. There's a quote from Australian tabletop RPG critic Merrick Blackman that I love. It really opened my eyes to how I think about combat, especially in Dungeons & Dragons. Quote, "When people want balanced combat in Dungeons & Dragons, they don't want combat that is a 50-50 chance of either side winning. They want combat that the PCs will almost always win, but feels like they might lose. As you might expect, this is a bit tricky to pull off."
Mm-hmm.
And that's because in Dungeons & Dragons, end quote, by the way, that's because in Dungeons & Dragons, you're playing heroic adventurers.
Mm-hmm.
You want to fight the dragon, but you don't want a 50-50 chance of being killed by the dragon. You want to succeed against the odds and fly up and punch the dragon in the face.
Yeah, I mean, unless that's something that everybody at the table is deliberately going for, of we really want to be super risky, and we're kind of playing, we're playing a game where it's let's see how hard of a hit these guys can take until we finally get to a TPK. You absolutely could play a campaign like that where it is punishing and brutal, but most people, they want their characters to get to the end of the campaign,
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it can't feel easy. I mean, I will say there is something to be said about every now and then throwing in a quick combat session that is a piece of cake to the players, where they get to feel so competent and strong that they just absolutely decimate these enemies in a couple of rounds. I think that there is absolutely value to that, especially if your players have if the party's been through it really and everybody needs a little bit of a release or a confidence booster or whatever, yeah, throw them a ridiculously easy combat where they get to feel super powerful. It's fun, and and it could make them, especially if there has been some brutal fights that have been really stressful, where the combat has been very do or die for the party and players have been making death saving throws and it's gotten stressful. Throwing in a little bit of a softball combat session to give your players a little bit more confidence again in their battle strategies and their abilities could be a good way to just kind of subtly check in without explicitly checking in, if that makes sense. And giving everybody just that confidence boost of I know that people we just had to revive people and all of that, but it's you guys are capable. Don't be scared, because what you don't want in a combat-based adventure game is for the party to become too skittish of combat.
Unless you're playing a horror game.
Yeah, unless you're playing a horror game, and that is the point. But if you're playing an action-adventure fantasy, that's not necessarily the point all of the time, where you want them to become too skittish or too risk-averse, Like I said, earlier, people will make mistakes in combat, and that's okay. You need to be willing to take big swings, and that needs to be okay. And everybody needs to sort of catch each other at the table and be well, you tried, that's okay. Yes, technically you blew an 8th level spell because they ended up saving against, feeble mind or whatever, but that would have been so clutch if it hit. Having at least one player at the table that is encouraging and a big fan for everybody can really help in stressful combat situations.
Having a hype man at the table?
Yeah, having a hype man at the table and having somebody that's cheering everybody on and saying nope, that's okay, or whatever, or even somebody who's I think I tend to do this a little bit where I'm oh, we're all gonna die, and everybody's don't say that, don't say that, don't say that. I'm no, this is a TPK, let's go, boo, boo. Kind of setting that mood and adding some levity to it, I think can be helpful to get everybody through a stressful combat situation.
Yeah, and figuring out the mood that you want from the combat is very important. Whether it's a heroic fight or being chased by a monster in a horror game, or a tactical mission where you're all a squad, breaking into an area, or a sexy duel between two people. Figuring out what kind of mood you want from the combat is very important, along with knowing the rules for combat in your game. There is also, you kind of talked about this with, it's hey, sometimes throw in an encounter where the party is overpowered and it's easy. Like, you don't have to make the combats all like the same level of difficulty. Some of them can be easy. Some of them can be incredibly hard. And of course, you want like that good mix of like, all right, these are like the standard difficulty of combat. But thinking about the combat that you're setting up, how does this scene impact the story, whether small or big? So, in D&D, there's like random encounters, or when you're doing a dungeon crawl, sometimes you just go into a room and there's an ogre, or there's 3 goblins or something like that. It's not supposed to be, a big set piece fight. This is a fight that the party is just going through. But small encounters can still inform about the world. Like if you're on the road and the party gets attacked by a bunch of bandits and then they mop the floor of the bandits, well, that still informs that this world has bandits. Or you're going through a dungeon crawl and you go into a room and you fight some goblins. That shows like, oh, there are some goblin minions in this dungeon. And maybe the goblin minions talk about the person or thing that they're serving. Or maybe they, complain about being put on this shift and having their pay docked. And that tells you that the goblins work in a dungeon capitalist society for some reason. Even with the small encounters, you can still give off bits of the world, and also you can have that feeling of like, okay, we're competent, we can sweep through this. It's basically a puzzle that we've solved.
If if there's bandits that are highwaymen on the road that are attacking you, this is a larger like socioeconomic political issue for the kingdom that you are in. Like presumably this is something that like the small villagers are aware of as an issue. Like this is something that is plaguing them. Like bandits oftentimes, have been in the past soldiers that don't have anything to do. Like this happens a lot. Like kings will raise armies to go conquer other lands. And so they will give training and weapons. Well, they will call upon people to fight and raid, and sometimes they will provide some of these trainings and weapons, etc. Sometimes it's just like, you there, farmer, let's go. And then the soldiers, they will have a purpose. Their purpose is bloody and violent, and they're like raiding these villages or whatever. And then it's like, okay, the campaign is over, go back home. And sometimes they don't, and they become mercenaries or they become thieves because this is now like what they know to do. And this isn't me saying like all soldiers become bad guys after war. Like, hold up. Like that is historically speaking where you would see like highwaymen would have this background of they had been, or mercenaries in wartime, they don't have anything to do and their skill is to swing a sword and no king is paying them. They will still swing that sword to make their living. And that is an interesting, like, world-building thread that your players could deal with, or that your players may be.
I have so many thoughts about, like, bandit and raider as, like, a label RPGs will put on enemies to just denote, like, this person is okay to kill without question. And if I start talking about how many RPGs don't think about the circumstances of like bandits or raiders and how that classification like cheapens the story, that's going to be the rest of the episode. So it's either in a video essay or in another episode of this podcast, I'll need to like deep dive into like bandits and raiders as a class in RPGs.
The thing about humans... Yeah. The thing about humans and humanoids, I suppose, but us people, we're just big mammalian predators. And when you look at large mammalian predators across the world, they are the ones that they tend to sleep the most. They have high caloric needs, and they want to conserve their energy. So if they are working a lot in order to have to eat, and have security, and they're turning to violence to do so, how is the violence a better bet than anything else to meet those needs? Like, a leopard hunts gazelles because a leopard has to hunt gazelles to eat. They're not out there killing every gazelle all of the time. They hunt when they have to, and also are largely like unsuccessful. Predators don't fight other predators because it's too costly to do so. That's why that so many predators are either like social pack animals or they're solitary. And if they come into conflict with each other, they won't fight. They'll, unless it becomes like a territory dispute of I have to kill you so I can eat, they won't fight. They'll leave each other alone because it's too costly to them to get into a fight where they might be injured and then they can't hunt and then they'll die. Like, people are the same way. So if you have bandits and raiders and things like that, well, I mean, the Vikings were Vikinging all over the place because they were coming from a region where it was incredibly cold. It's harder to like get food because it's cold. It's a harsher environment. They cannot farm in the fjords as well as you can farm on the much more arable land of flatter England, you know? So they turned to raiding partially as, and we talked about this in our world building thing a little bit, in that violence is usually necessary because, well, violence becomes necessary to people because they need resources. And thus violence becomes the most effective way for them to get those resources. Your enemies are the same. Like, these raiders are the same. So yeah, you know, like, play with that.
Yeah. And what we're just talking about, that's a very important thing to think about when you're crafting the narrative of these combat encounters is, you know, a lot of times you should think about the combatants more than just being monsters. Granted, you can definitely have those games. I'm not thinking about the family situation of the demons that I slaughter in Doom.
Yeah.
They're demons. They are evil creatures made out of evil, and the point is for them to get slaughtered by the dozens. And very importantly, the Doom video game does not go into the details of like the demon family life. You know, that's not what they're trying to do. But let me reference Baldur's Gate 3 real quick. Baldur's Gate 3, the first chapter starts out pointing at like, oh, there is this group of tieflings and they're racist toward the Githyanki party member, but also they are refugees and the druids discriminate against the tieflings for being refugees. And oh no, there's these goblins across the hill, go slaughter them. And it's like, well, hang on. We just set up in the narrative that I should be thinking about the circumstances of people. And here's this group of goblins who understand economics, who can speak, who can write and all that. But the game is like, no, don't think about them. They're okay to wholesale slaughter.
Yeah.
So if you don't think about the combatants, you can get that dissonance.
And I think this kind of leads into a larger thing of like, you can set up your players to go through combat, but the end game of that combat doesn't actually have to be that they kill all of the enemies. You can absolutely start combat and then twist it on the, because I think that's generally, that's generally what we go into combat in a game like this. The goal is kill all the enemies. You don't have to do that. You can set your players up for combat and then have the enemies try and run away or try and resolve it, drop their swords and be like, wait, like, we don't want to die. Like, there are interesting different things that you can do with combat where you do get like the fun fight, but you kind of twist it on like, actually the enemies don't want to die, so they're going to start pleading for their lives. What will your players do? The situation could be like, the goal is to, if it's like a heist situation, the goal is to get this magic item out of the castle. Will they kill everybody to do that? Also, is everybody in that castle like a combatant? How do they feel about witnesses? We have absolutely, as a party, been in situations where there are obstacles, indisputably, like a combat situation. There are obstacles that are not combatants, but are also not allies. And that is an interesting, fun challenge to throw at your players. And, they can go murder hobo on their asses and be like, fuck the collateral damage. Or not. And there could be consequences outside of the combat for whether or not they show mercy to these people. And there can be situations where you could set them up to have to make like these incredibly dark and like objectively evil choices. If you set it up where there is an innocent person that maybe they have to, like, making the choice of, like, no, you kind of have to, like, if you don't kill them, this is going to bite you in the ass in a really hard way. And sort of put your characters in a corner, if you want, and in these combat situations where maybe they do something really dark or whatever for the betterment of the party or the advancement of the party. And, we're going to do an episode on, like, dark themes and getting into, evil campaigns or evil choices or or dealing with things that are in game traumatizing and that are not light or whatever. And we'll talk about that more then. But if your table is cool with that, don't be afraid to like lean in. If you're playing a game where you can throw some really hard decisions at your players in combat, I would encourage you to, because that is one way. People, I think GMs are often thinking like, how can I make this combat more interesting? How can I make it challenging? How can I make it different from combat that we normally do? Spice it up, etc. One way to spice it up is by forcing your characters to make really difficult decisions instead of just like fighting a more powerful opponent.
And, the other thing that you said, having goals other than kill everyone in certain combats is another way to make combats very interesting. Like, a few that I keep up my sleeve are like, a dark ritual is taking place. Some of the party needs to stop the ritual while they're also fending off these enemies. Or, you could have like, are the heroes attacking an encampment? And if so, they have to break through defenses. Or are they defending against a siege? And if so, they have to build up those defenses. Or is there someone that the enemies are trying to kidnap? And if so, the heroes have to like try to like keep them from being kidnapped. Or do the enemies have an important object and the enemies aren't even trying to kill them, they're just trying to get away? And then it becomes this like chase combat scene of like, all right, we just need to get close enough to these people so that way we can take this thing from them, and then we need to get out. Or they're doing a chase scene, and they're all driving wagons, and then it's like, all right, we need to focus on killing these guys, but also we need to focus on not crashing into anybody. And just adding those other goals besides kill everyone in sight makes the combat so much more interesting. Not every combat, of course, has to be like that.
No.
But you do have to switch it up every now and then to keep things interesting.
Yeah, I think definitely starting, it's like a layer cake, And so if you are looking to do kind of one of these bigger, potentially session-long combat situations, start with, build it out in layers and start with, okay, this is the base layer of the main enemies. Okay, secondary thing. Yeah. Is it a ritual? Is it a chase sequence? Is a particular friendly NPC being targeted? And sort of just build it in there, layer by layer. And you could like be revealing as combat is going on, sort of revealing to the players that there is something greater going on. Your enemies have a goal that is not killing you. And now you need to deal with thwarting that goal in a way that may not be killing them.
Another thing to keep in mind when crafting interesting combats, and I'm going to bring back 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons here real quick, is the roles of the enemies in the combat. Like, even in a combat where it's just like kill everyone in sight, your enemies can be performing sort of different roles within the combat itself. Maybe they're using their own teamwork against the party. 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons did something very cool where they gave all of the enemies like their roles. Like, this monster walks in, takes a bunch of damage, and also deals a bunch of damage. They're a brute. This monster stays, in the back and like fires at enemies from a range. They're artillery. This monster comes in, does some damage, and then gets out. They're a skirmisher. And this monster stays in the back and has a bunch of abilities that like hypes up the rest of the monsters or coordinates. And they're the leader. And, just like thinking about, what are all these enemies besides people that walk up to the nearest hero and try to hit them real hard with a club can also make combat more interesting. Because there's a difference between you walk into a room and there's 3 goblins, and you walk into a room and there's 1 goblin with a big sword, and then there's 2 goblins on raised platforms with bows and arrows shooting down at you.
Yeah, thinking about the environment where the combat is going to take place too is really important and can add a lot of variety and challenge to the situation. And that could be, when we talk about adding layers, one of the layers could just be, well, the layer, that you're in. It could just be the environment and figuring out, well, how do I get up really high? And just sort of the challenge of the extra challenge of the combat could just be that the environment that everybody is in is like constantly shifting or changing, or the enemies are like all over the place. And that is what the players need to deal with, is that it is a constantly moving battlefield of some kind, that they cannot just plant themselves in one spot and fight this swarm. They need to be like moving around somehow. There's flying creatures or whatever that they can't get at, etc. But yeah, Absolutely. Like, it's just figuring out, what's going to be the different sort of challenge. Now, I believe you've mentioned reading this particular author's work in the past, but Keith Amon, is that how you say his last name? Who wrote The Monsters Know What They're Doing, Combat Tactics. Yes. He has several books that he has written about combat within specifically D&D, but I think it's something that like can be expounded upon to other systems that are combat tactics for the dungeon master, combat tactics for the players. So if war games and combat strategy and things like that are something that is very new to you, if you feel a little unfamiliar or you want to know more, and you're saying like, yeah, sure, this is all well and great, what you guys are saying, but practically, like, how do I apply this? How do I, like, step by step do this? Check out Keith Amon's books. I believe they're available, like, on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or, I don't know, maybe he has, like, a store. We'll put some, like, links in the show notes. But he does have books that are specifically about, like, here are different things you can do in combat. Mm-hmm. Whether you've been doing this for a while and you just want some inspiration, or whether you're pretty new to it and you need some help getting started, check that out.
It was originally a blog he was doing, and then he collected a bunch of it and then released it as a book, and then he released like other books. I also met him, by the way, at Gen Con 2023. Pretty cool guy.
Okay, cool. Yeah, we'll link that blog, the books, whatever. We'll put that in the show notes so you guys could go check that out. Mm-hmm. And that, that's a good resource. And I'm sure there's also other resources like that online too that can give you some like actual, here is an encounter to use wholesale. That you don't have to make up. If everybody is busy with their adult lives, we don't all have time to sit down and plan out an incredibly complicated combat situation in prep, so feel free to, other people have, and they have put it out there for you to use. So have at it.
One thing to keep in mind, and I think we touched on this in our previous episode about knowing the rules, is that roleplay and combat should not be separated. Like, during combat, keep that combat banter in mind. If you're the GM, have, the villains throw out a muhahaha, or you'll never stop me, or a know my plans, like every now and then. If you're a player, like throw out a have at you, or huzzah, if you're if you're playing that kind of game.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the best lines that we've thrown out have been in combat, partially because while you're waiting for your turn, you have some time to think, so that's another thing that you could be doing while you're waiting for your turn, is thinking of like, what cool line am I going to say or whatever,
Yeah. And you can play a game like I hit the thing and I deal 9 damage, or you can play it as, I slice my sword across its chest and I deal 9 damage. Giving a little bit of that blow-by-blow description can also be another thing that keeps the combat interesting and, like, helps you visualize and keeps it cinematic. There is a way to overdo it, of course.
Yeah.
And sometimes, to keep the combat flowing, sometimes you're like, okay, you get 4 damage, you get 5 damage, you get 7 damage next turn. But, keep that in mind. Like, don't separate the roleplay and the combat. It's still a scene. It's still a narrative. Have fun.
Yeah, I think one of the things, we've talked about this I've mentioned this on the podcast before, about how I have been a caster main mostly, but in the current campaign that I'm playing with Kevin, I am now a paladin, which is a half caster, but is primarily a martial class.
And by the way, if you want to hear more about that campaign, we have a bonus episode about Curse of Strahd and different ways that we've, run the campaign and our current campaign adventures in there. You can check out that bonus episode if you donate to our Ko-fi, link in the show notes. Kayla, sorry to interrupt you.
Oh my God, what a natural plug. One of the reasons that I held on to being a caster so much, and one of the reasons I like being a caster so much, is the variety that I felt that I have in combat with all of these different spell options. I had the perception that if I was playing a martial character, that every turn was basically going to be, and now I swing my sword for such and such damage, And I was like, that's boring. I want to do different stuff every turn. Playing a paladin now, it is a lot of, I swing my sword for such and such damage. But also, it is incredibly gratifying to me, for who I am as a player, to just be doing a massive amount of damage every turn and to be taking a lot of hits. It's really great. But one of the other things that has been helpful is that in this particular campaign, we have NPCs that are not heavy combatants that are being targeted very often by the enemies. And like we have specifically with Curse of Strahd, you know, if you've played or if you've heard anything about it, there's the NPC Irina, who in one of the pathways that you can play in Curse of Strahd, because you can play kind of different storylines, Irina is a little bit of like a damsel in distress. And what the party is doing is like basically one big escort bodyguard quest to protect Irina from Strahd. And I made my character attached to Irina so that in combat, if Irina's getting targeted, well, guess what? My character now has another thing to worry about that isn't just stand there and swing the sword. This is where the RP can really come into combat. If your player character is attached to an NPC or another player character, and they're going to make different choices if that person is in danger, you know, that's something that you can do in RP, and that's another way to sort of switch up combat and to make different choices. And that's something that can be for good or for ill, you know, that that your character is now putting either their life or other people's lives on the line for a different character. You know, they're breaking like the general plan because of this. That can be very dramatic and high stakes. My wizard character was attached in a way to another PC who was a cleric. And so that cleric was constantly just pumping health into my wizard character. And thus in combat, like it would be a whole thing. If my wizard character was going down, guess who was hogging the healing? But, you know, it creates, like, these create bonds between the characters, potentially. Like, you know, it was like, there was that bond that was happening, and then through combat, this cleric started mothering the wizard, because out of necessity of, like, the wizard has no HP and is still putting herself in a situation where she gets hit a lot. Well, guess what? Now the wizard is going to be attached to the cleric because they keep getting healed by the cleric. Like, you can look at how your combat strategy is affecting your players and those dynamics. Explore that outside of combat, because guess what? Now you guys are going to be closer. You know, it's like in Pacific Rim where it's like people are drift compatible, you know, have fun with that. And it can be like these character relationships, you know, they can be whatever. They can be friendships, they could be romantic, they could be paternal, whatever.
That is something that I've noticed in a lot of D&D campaigns, especially the longer run ones. It's like at the start of the campaign, a lot of times you have these characters who don't know each other, and then it just takes like one or two fights for everyone to be on the same page of like, okay, we have watched each other's backs in a deadly situation, and now we are, you know, good companions. And that's like, honestly, that's how it works a lot in real life. Like if I get into a fight and then someone has my back, I'm inviting that person to all my birthdays. Like,
yeah, if you have players, if you have a party that doesn't know each other and is maybe distrustful of each other, if it's kind of a thing where everybody's like, yeah, I'm playing a loner character who doesn't have any friends.
Oh, so edgy.
Yeah, that's a, you know, it's such a cliche player character or whatever, especially for newer characters, is to want to play, you know, these badass loners or whatever. You want to make everybody friends? Put everybody's lives at risk. Have them bond very quickly by having to save each other's asses. And you can, as the DM, you can specifically set it up where they need to save each other, where the character cannot get out of it themselves and they need another character to come help them. That is a great way to get the party to quickly bond with each other. And players, again, it's a social game. Lean into that. Like, that's what you want to do. Allow yourself to be rescued, and then you will rescue in turn, you know.
But we've also played campaigns where, like, through combat, rivalries were built up.
Oh, yeah.
Because there were characters that had, like, similar movesets, or there were characters that were, like, dealing more damage in combat than another character, and suddenly there's, like, I don't like you now, even though you are helping me.
A little bit of a Legolas and Gimli
yes.
rivalry. Absolutely. Yeah, that is like a fun thing that you can do too, you know.
We've had a lot of really cool combat scenes in our campaigns, but now I'm curious, audience, has there been any like really cool fight scenes that you've been a part of in your RPGs? It doesn't have to be Dungeons & Dragons, it could be any sort of campaign. It can even be a game that isn't built for combat. But if there was like just a combat scene that was just like, this was really cool, and it was really cool to our story, and it was really fun to play, let us know. Send us a message in the comments or on our Ko-fi page. And oh, hey, while I'm talking about that, if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe, give us a rating, leave a comment, and share it with a friend. As always, the best kind of marketing is word of mouth. Follow us on social media. We got the links in the show notes. And we'll also have links to some of the stuff that we talked about, including the Monsters Know What They're Doing blog. Really great resource if you're playing Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. We also have a Ko-fi. You can support us there and get access to cool bonus content like extra episodes, such as our Curse of Strahd talk-along, where we just talk about our Curse of Strahd campaign and rewriting the Curse of Strahd campaign and all that good stuff. If you want to hear us talk more about D&D, check out our Ko-fi page. You can also get early access to our episodes, access to our private Discord, so please feel free to check it out. Do you want to do the outro, or should I take it from here?
I can do it.
Cool, go for it. Kayla, send us off.
Writing for Roleplay is a production of Digital Kaiju Studios. It is hosted and produced by Kevin Carpenter and Kayla Knudsen. It is edited mostly by Kevin, because Kayla volunteered to do other stuff, like listen to the episodes that Kevin edited and then approve them. We post a new episode every Tuesday. See you next week.
See you next week.